tables. We'll keep it going in a little bit. We always just love to pause and share a story from Jesus' life, which I'm going to do tonight, and hopefully we get some chance just to think about it, talk about it around the table. Before I do that, I was thinking about our community time question and Thanksgiving meals together, and my family didn't really have a strong tradition of celebrating Thanksgiving. That's mostly because they were outdoorsmen and it's hunting season in Wisconsin, and it kind of just threw things off for Thanksgiving. But we have a really strong Christmas gathering, and when I say family, I mean small Swedish tribe in northern Wisconsin. So my dad has 4 brothers. They all have kids. I think when we're all together, there's like 60 odd people around tables like this, and it's a bit chaotic. And I remember one particular Christmas gathering we've since not done this anymore, but we tried to cram in my grandmother and grandpa's house one more time. And there was tables everywhere, and I was really excited for this Christmas gathering because I had been traveling for college. I'd been out of state for college, and I was back visiting. And I was like 21, 22 years old. I was learning some stuff about the world. I was excited. I was adulting. I was feeling proud of myself. So I was excited to come back and, share about what I had learned out in the big world out there around the Christmas table. And so when I came in, greeted people, and started to circle the main table where all the adults sat. And my grandmother is very, planned and organized, and the people who put this on, so there's little name tags that she uses year after year. So I'm kind of like out of the corner of my eye looking for my name tag around the big table where the adults sit, and I do like 2 laps, and I can't find it, and I'm starting to feel like, what's going on here? And to make it worse, I had younger cousins' names who I saw at the grown-up table who were married, but I was not married. And I was starting to pick it up. I was like, what's going on here? So then I went out to the periphery a little bit, and I circled this small green card table, and I saw my name right there next to my, I think, 8-year-old and 6-year-old cousin, along with one other older cousin who is not yet married as well. And so you can pick up on this in my tone that the rest of the gathering was a little tense, would we say? But I remember after the meal progressed a little bit, just making light of it and having some fun. But I remember that moment, that tinge of pain a little bit, of disappointment. And I would hope now, being 34, that I would come into that with a little bit more grace and be excited to be with the children. But at 21, I was a little heartbroken and a little offended that I got the card table with the little kids. And I was reflecting on why that was, so painful for me, or why there was so much tension in that seating arrangement. And I think in that, sorry, I got a chickpea or whatever one of those was in my throat. Sorry. I was reflecting on why that was a painful moment for me. And I think in that season of life, in 21, 22 is a season of life where you're asking some like fundamental identity questions, questions like, who am I? And more specifically, where do I belong? And who do I belong with? And I remember reflecting back on that experience being relegated to the green card table. It raised some questions because I had ventured out and I had brought back some questions about, do I still belong here after I've changed, after I've learned some things? And it kind of tinged some of those questions in me. And that question I've returned to again and again in my life. Where do I belong and who do I belong with? And I think that's one of life's most fundamental questions. And the Jesus story tonight is in the midst of some Jesus stories where we've been asking, hey, what was the good news that Jesus shared when he was here on earth? And tonight, one of the stories we're going to tell, I think, has some good news to share with that question, who do I belong to and where do I belong? And so to cue up this story, this is kind of a famous story from Jesus, maybe one you've heard before. I'm going to try to maybe read it a little bit and maybe tell it, to maybe do my best to make it feel more like when he actually told it. And in order to do that, you have to understand the context that this story comes to us in. This is Luke chapter 15. If you want to go to Luke 15 on a phone or something like that, you can. Or just listen to me read/tell the story a little bit and notice what Jesus is trying to say about who belongs and whose table people belong at. I want to start at the beginning of the chapter because it's important to understand the context Jesus is in. This is a moment where there's this group called the Pharisees, which are religious leaders of the time, who aren't the best friends of Jesus. They're always questioning what he does, and they're always questioning who he's hanging out with. And at the beginning of the chapter, it says that a bunch of people that are named tax collectors and people of questionable reputation, some translation says, are coming to Jesus to learn from him. And what we hear next is the Pharisees are a little upset about this, and they say, this Jesus dude, he is always welcoming and eating with tax collectors and sinners. So we could even possibly infer from that statement that these Pharisees are coming up on a moment where Jesus is at one of these type of gathering, sitting with these people of questionable reputation and teaching them, and not only that, welcoming them into his presence, which was a huge deal for him to do. And it's in that context that he tells a series of 3 stories that have to do with things that are lost and then get found. And the last story he tells is the story of 2 sons and a father. Jesus says, to illustrate the point further, or it says, to illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. He said, a man had 2 sons. There's a younger son, and he told the father, so Jesus spills into the story and says, he told the father, I want my share of your estate now before I die. Now, some of you might recognize this is the story of what's often called the Prodigal Son. But I want to stop right there at that statement and notice how ridiculous and mean that statement is. It's the younger son basically saying to the father, like, I'd rather have what you have instead of you be alive right now, is what he's essentially saying to him. And this father's response is, so the father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons, which is totally in the moment with those others there. Everybody would have like a moment. He did what? Like he actually responded to his son's ridiculous request by abdicating or like dividing his estate. So it says he divided it between his sons. We don't know how. Probably the older son got more, but still, dividing it before someone's death is just ridiculous. Can you imagine even today going to your grandparent or something like that, or going to your parent and be like, hey, can I get my inheritance now, please? Can we just work this out now? Even today, that would be ridiculous, and so much more back then. And then it says a few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. It's really interesting. I don't know if he had the intention to do this right away, or but maybe after the fact that he had asked this audacious question of his father, he decided to hightail it out of there. And Jesus says, and there, in this distant land that he went away to, he wasted all his money on wild living. About the time his money ran out, so can you imagine spending through all his money, a great famine swept over the land, Jesus said, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into the fields to feed pigs. That was his job. That's just like 2 sentences, but wow, my words. That's amazing how fast that all transpired. Going with a bag full of money, losing it, starving, famine coming, and all of a sudden you're feeding pigs. And it says the young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, Jesus is telling the story, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So the son is like rehearsing this in his mind. So he returned home to his father, And while he was still a long way off, and you can imagine him rehearsing this little speech, thinking about how this is going to go, imagining every scenario about how his father, who he completely offended, is going to respond. And then it says, Jesus says this, while he was still a long way off, the son, his father saw him coming. Filled with compassion, he ran to his son. He embraced him. He kissed him. His son said to him, his rehearsed speech, "Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son." But his father said to his servants, almost like I imagine his father just like interrupting the speech, not paying attention to the speech, immediately turns to his servants and says, "Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get the ring on his finger and the sandals on his feet." That ring was probably a signet of the family symbol. Put it on the ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for the son of mine was dead, and now he's returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. Meanwhile, it says, Jesus said, meanwhile. I almost imagine in this moment when Jesus is telling this story that the people who he is eating with, those of questionable reputation, were all leaning into the story at this moment with their eyes wide open. And then Jesus says, meanwhile, and maybe stares up at the group of Pharisees who are looking at this questionable dinner party that he's telling these stories at, and then tells this part of the story. He says, meanwhile, the older son was in the field working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of his servants what was going on. The servant said, "Your brother is back, and your father has killed the fatted calf. We were celebrating because of his safe return." And you can imagine at this dinner party that Jesus is at, all the people sitting around him start looking at the Pharisees to see how they'll react to this part of the story. The older brother was angry, Jesus said, and he wouldn't go in. Notice this. The father came out to him as well and begged him to come in. But he replied, the son did, the older son, "All these years I have slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. And in all that time, you never even gave me a young goat to feast with my friends." I just got to laugh. Like, who asks for a goat these days? Like, this is such an ancient story, right? You never even gave me a goat. He's clearly mad. He's clearly perplexed at how generous, how extravagant this response to his brother coming home is. And he goes on, "Yet when this son of yours," doesn't even call him his brother, "comes back after squandering your money on who knows what," and it even says on sex workers or prostitutes, and we don't actually know if that's a part of his brother's story. He's just making that accusation about his brother. "You celebrate by killing the fattened calf." His father said to him, Jesus said, "Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he's found." It's quite a story, isn't it? In a moment, we're going to ask what stood out to you about that story. What resonated with you? What difference do you think this ancient story that Jesus told around that dinner party, much like we're having tonight, what difference do you think it made then? What difference do you think it makes now? When I was reading the story earlier this week and this month, thinking about tonight, one of the things that stuck out to me was that at both of the sons, the younger and the older one, at different points were more focused on what they could get from their father than the father himself. They're more focused on what they could get from the father than the father himself. And if you step back from how many times you've heard this story and just take the story in, one of the things, if I was there in the story, is I'd want to shake these brothers by the coat and say, "Don't you see how amazing your father is? Like, what have you missed all of these years?" But it doesn't take me long to reflect on my own life, how just like them, I can be blind to that sort of generosity, that sort of love in my own life. And it begged the question for me as I was trying to resonate with these sons' stories, if they've never maybe resolved the same question I was walking into that family Christmas with, the question of where do I belong? Whose table do I belong at? They were both blind to who their father was. The younger was convinced he would never belong at the table because of what he had done. And the other was convinced that he was the only one who belonged at that table because of what he had done. They were both had unresolved answers to who and where they belong. It's interesting that the father repeats this phrase twice. I don't know if you noticed that. He repeats this phrase, my son was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and then he's found. I was thinking about what Jesus meant when he introduced that phrase twice into the story. And I think he meant a lot of things. I think he meant something that he was about to do at the end of the gospel stories. But he meant something, and as I reflected on that, I reflected on my life when I feel most lost in my life and when I feel least alive. I'm usually running from something or trying to prove something. Let me say that again. When I feel most lost in my life, when I feel least alive in my life, I'm usually trying to run from something, or I'm usually trying to prove something. And it strikes me that that is a pretty decent summation of either one of those sons' response to their father and relationship with him. I know the restlessness that goes with the gnawing question, where do I belong? I know how much I've run myself ragged trying to prove myself, running away from some of the pain or mistakes I've made in my life. And it reminds me of this phrase of one of the church fathers, Father Augustine, when he said, our souls are restless until they find rest in you. And the you he's referring to is God. I feel most at home, most centered, most who I am when I know who I am and I know whose I am and I know whose table I belong around. So as we go into conversations around these tables, I just maybe want to ask some questions of you. As we go into this Thanksgiving week, and maybe you're gathering with family, maybe you're gathering with friends, but maybe this week raises some of those questions for you. Whose table do I belong around? And where do I belong? And to you, I would say, would you hear Jesus' clear message in this story to the people around him, that the question to whose table you belong around is always mine from Jesus. You're always welcomed around his table. I think he wore that accusation from the Pharisees with pride, someone who welcomes people of questionable reputation, people who are running from something, and people who are trying their hardest to prove something that's already true of them, that they're already welcomed around his table. So this community giving is about generosity. I was remembering a story from Connie, who I mentioned earlier, who a few years ago, she showed up at our door on Christmas, a couple days before Christmas, with presents in hand for our kids, which was a really sweet thing. And I was blown away by her generosity of sharing those gifts with our kids. And I stood there and I said, man, I'm kind of awestruck. And part of the reason I was awestruck is that I had been a part of some financial counseling conversations with Connie. And I was helping her through her finances. And I knew I was acutely aware of how much margin she was living on, how much she was giving to the home that she was living in. And with that knowledge, I was blown away by the proportion of her generosity in that moment to our kids. And I found myself wondering, what can compel this woman to such generosity and gratitude? And I think if you were to sit down with Connie and ask her that question, she would say, I know who I belong to. I know who my center is. I know that there is enough and extravagance around God's table, that I have what I need. Even if I've run from it, even if I've tried to prove it myself, when I come back to God's table, there's enough for me there. See, I think what Connie understood and what hopefully we can understand tonight, that the basis of generosity is knowing who we belong to, and that we're always welcome around God's table. When we have those eyes to see the generous Father, we can see others around us differently. We don't see them with the eyes of the older father, or we don't see them with the unbelieving, undeserving eyes of the younger son. We see them with the Father's eyes, who's trained us that when someone comes home, when someone comes around the table, we kill the fatted calf. We don't do that anymore. We don't kill the fatted calf together, but we celebrate. This on every Sunday is a proclamation of this good news, that everyone's welcome around the table, that there's always room around the table. And the answer to people's questioning of where I belong, Jesus' answer to that is always around my table. So let's take for this next few minutes here, just reflect on this story and ask yourself, what's standing out to you? What's sticking with you? What difference do you think this story makes in your own life? We'll just chat around the table for the next few minutes with the people around you. Try to share, keep it to 2 minutes. And if you don't have anything to share tonight and you just want to say pass, that's totally fine. We call this sometimes listening time because it's just a gift to listen to the others around the table with you. So for the next few minutes, let's do that. And then I'll come back together and we'll share some communion together.